Welcome to For Podcasts. With me is Flavius Mihais again. Flavius has been to Ukraine. He's an independent journalist. Earlier, he's worked for the World Bank. He's French. He is an interesting chap. And without further ado, Flavius, welcome.
Thank you, Atul. It's good to be back.
Good. Today we are discussing NATO. So, on 4 April 1949, when NATO was formed, 12 countries joined as members. And throughout the Cold War, NATO was an anti-Soviet alliance. The Soviet Union itself collapsed in 1991. However, since 1991, NATO has expanded from 16 to 32 members, starting from the first wave of Cold War enlargement in 1999. Most recently, Finland and Sweden have joined NATO. So, Flavius, what has this expansion done to the organization?
Thank you. That's a great question. If you look at the conflict in Ukraine today, there are really two schools of thoughts looking at it. One is that Vladimir Putin, the Russian president, allegedly mistaken himself for Peter the Great and invaded Ukraine to recreate the Russian Empire.
Yes.
And the other school of thought is that President Putin went to war to prevent more NATO on his borders. Since I'm not privy to Vladimir Putin's psychology, let's delve into the NATO aspect to the question. Well, as you mentioned, NATO started at 12 members. By the end of the Cold War, when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, NATO was at 16 members, and today doubled up 32 members, and it has shifted predominantly eastward. What does it mean? With those, not every member is born equal, and with that shift toward the east, you have a succession of countries that are near on Russia border and had been gobbled up by the Soviet Union.
Poland is a classic example.
Absolutely, absolutely. So they have a recent, fresh history of subjugation, domination by the Soviet Empire. However, we know Russia was at the helm of that union.
No, I mean, the Poles have not forgotten the massacre of the Katyn forest, which, of course, Uncle Joe Stalin very kindly blamed Adolf Hitler. But it turned out later that it was the Soviets who put a bullet in the back of the heads of so many Poles who were the leaders of society. The flower of Polish society was slaughtered by the Soviets, and the Poles have not forgotten that.
Absolutely, and this was well captured by historian Timothy Snyder, speaking of that region as the Bloodland.
Yeah,
right. That's brought from Nazi and Soviet domination. And so in many cases, as you mentioned with the example of the Katyn example, this generation or just the one preceding it are still alive. And they carry that trauma, they carry that recent history. And the consequence of having them being part of NATO is that very much lived history is going to affect the alliance identity, as we said, these decisions, its future. And it has shifted for the European part of the alliance. We know, of course, the US is the dominant player here. It has shifted the alliance strategic way toward the east. What does that mean? It means that...
So in practical terms, exactly, I was going to ask you, what does it mean? Does that mean that NATO has gone from being an anti-Soviet alliance to being an anti-Russian one?
Well, plausibly, these countries see Russia as the successor of the Soviet Union, and with their past still very much present, they bring their grievance and their fears, in many cases legitimate. My parents are from Romania, and the last thing they want is to have
a recurrence of Nicolae Ceausescu.
Exactly, and the foreign boots from the east on their neck, right? Mm-hmm. And but it also affects how NATO picks up its battles, and it has had a more aggressive stance toward Russia as a result. It's part of that dynamic. There's new members bringing their experience, their fear. It's not something to ignore. if you look at the relation between those new members and the U.S., well, there is certainly a role of recent NATO history with Iraq and Afghanistan, where the New Europe, as Donald Rumsfeld,
Donald Rumsfeld said,
infamously, the Secretary of State, infamously called. Distinguished between old Europe and New Europe. The New Europe supported the U.S. invasion of Iraq.
France and Germany did not. Gerhard Schroeder and Jacques Chirac famously did not. Of course, Tony Blair did. Tony Blair supported.
Absolutely.
But that's the Anglo-Saxon alliance.
As someone I heard recently called the UK, it's the unsinkable U.S. aircraft carrier in Europe. But you're absolutely right. France and Germany opposed it, and one can say this was perhaps the last example of what Macron likes, French President Emmanuel Macron likes to call strategic autonomy. It was the last example of France's strategic autonomy, certainly when it relates to NATO. So in exchange of as a reward of the new Europe, quote unquote, support for the U.S.-led invasion of Iraq, the U.S. facilitated and supported their accessions to NATO. So those countries they're tied, their views and their destiny in many ways to the U.S. far more than, as you said, your examples.
But having said that, it's important, Flavius, to make a distinction between new members as well. Poland is toying with the idea of having nuclear weapons as a deterrence to yet another Russian conquest. And remember, that goes well beyond the Soviet Union. It goes back to the Romanov Empire too. The Poles have suffered a lot because of Germany and Russia. And Hitler and Stalin gobbled up Poland, lest we forget, in 1939. On the other hand, you have Hungary, which also has trauma. 1956, you had tanks roll out on the streets of Budapest. But Hungary's leader, Viktor Orban, is said to be sympathetic, some would say realistic, about having to deal with Russia. So even amongst the new members, there is daylight. It isn't that all of them have the same worldview.
Absolutely. And that tells you how much the perceptions of Russia today depends on the actors, even within actors that had the same history, right? And there is not necessarily one single way of looking at Russia, especially as some have noted that Russia has never expressed any aggressive stance toward Eastern Europe,
Since 1991.
Yeah. And then the question for the initial members and the Western members of the alliance is, do we want to be, quote unquote, dragged into the fear of an actor like Poland, perhaps, or follow a more realistic, some would say fact-based position that Viktor Orban has vis-a-vis Europe and Russia, trying to balance both, the interest of his energy policy and also in general Hungarian national interest.
Yeah, I mean, in fact, a Czech diplomat who also, remember the Czechs suffered the Prague Spring in 1968. The Soviets brutally crushed that. But a Czech diplomat once told me that, yes, we've had a tragic past. The Soviets were just like imperialists of the 19th century in many ways. But now the Russians are no longer the power they once were. Their demography is declining. They are not in a position to take over as they did in 1968. So why poke the bear in the eye? So there are varying degrees of perceptions, and those perceptions determine different policy positions.
Absolutely. In fact, if you look objectively at Russia today, the country is losing 800,000 folks every year.
800 people a year. So their population is declining by 800,000 a year. In fact, post-1991, the economy cratered, life expectancy went down. And the big fear Russia has is the hollowing out of its population and making Eastern Russia, Siberia, vulnerable to Chinese immigrants, many of whom are already coming in from China and marrying local girls.
Absolutely, I take your word on the local girl stories, and I'm sure there are many examples. But
No, I read a long story sent by a Russian friend on
yeah,
it.
no, absolutely. In fact, some analysts look at China not so much as an imperialistic power via military might, but via demography, trade and demography, right? But you're absolutely right. The Russia is barely recovering. In fact, recovering might be too optimistic, as we just saw with the demographic loss. And the UN has predicted a loss of 14 million population of working age in Russia between 2009 and 2025 next year. So the Russian leaders have a lot on their hands to worry about and to focus on. An example of that, you mentioned the Czech Republic and Hungary, is that European countries have not increased their defense spending since the Cold War. And you might argue if they were worried about Russian ambition, you would have seen more investment.
There is talk
defense,
of it
right?
now. Germany has promised to, hasn't done yet.
Right.
There is promise to increase, but that means that they will have to cut down on social benefits. And I don't think Western Europe, I don't know about Eastern Europe, but I can certainly say Western Europe doesn't seem to be ready for that sacrifice.
Right. And some Eastern European countries themselves would say, well, there is no evidence that Russia is going on a rampage across Europe, and that certainly is something for Western Europe to position itself toward. Right. You have France, who until recently has trained.
Now that you've mentioned France, let's talk about the Weltanschauung, as the Germans like to say. They come up with great words. I have to say, Zeitgeist is one of my favorite words. But let's use this German word, which means worldview. The Weltanschauung of traditional European powers, UK, France, and Germany, and how it differs from the new members, the members in Eastern Europe, and indeed the newest members, Sweden and Finland. So I'd love to hear more about the differences in Weltanschauung from you.
Germany is an interesting case, right? Because you can draw a parallel with the conflict in Palestine, Israel-Palestine today. What Germany has, with the expansion of NATO after Cold War, has largely sided with this new member, this European member. Part of it is trade; these are markets, and part of it is also the historical guilt for Second World War. And one might argue that Germany.
Well, German guilt has defined its foreign policy since 1945. It's, in the harsh words of many of its critics, it's an economic giant, but a political pygmy.
And you see that with Israel very vividly today, where the unconditional support of Germany toward anything Israel does, even if the International Court of Justice will say there's a plausible case of genocide, is unchallenged. And certainly you've seen that shift, that fracture between Germany being supporting of the Eastern European country, again, for economic reasons, for political guilt, and France, on the other hand, until recently, making an attempt to balance between its interests, which are peace in Europe and good relationship with its neighbors, with supporting the bloc stance toward Ukraine and Russia. Until recently, I say, because last month, as your audience will probably know, France created some uproar around the alliance.
By saying that French troops could be invested in Ukraine to save Ukraine from falling to Russian troops.
Correct.
But a lot of people also say that maybe because the Russians have booted the French out of Francophone Afrique. The French have been booted out of the Sahel, and they've been replaced by Russians, Russian mercenaries. So maybe it's a little bit of bitterness stemming from that too.
There's plenty bitterness in French politics, as we might.
There may be one country without bitterness. There is bitterness in Britain. Look at
right.
what's happening post Brexit.
Exactly. In fact,
the Conservative Party
no,
is
you're
cannibalizing
right.
itself.
We talk about Russia and Poland. In fact, a synonym for geopolitics might be bitterness. But no, absolutely. The African case is an interesting example, because many Africans from West Africa, where the Operation Barkhane was operating, I've noted how the French has been the lack of efficiency for France fighting terrorism there, and just the loss of credibility for the French military to protect those countries, Niger, Burkina Faso, Mali.
But anyway, let's come back instead of getting sucked into Africa.
Sure,
let's talk about France being different to the UK, wanting negotiation. In fact, there was a photograph of Macron sitting face à face across a very long table with Putin. And now, of course, tensions have risen.
To your point, I think that certainly plausibly has played a role, right? Is that France has lost to, not so much because of Russia, nefarious intent, but again, in large part because it didn't work. Its policy didn't work to address the terrorism and to make the situation better. On the other hand, quickly to wrap up on this example that you're absolutely right to mention, my contact in Mali, for example, told me that the Wagner group has been much more successful at bringing peace in central and northern Mali, where the French
it helps if you're brutal.
Well, I don't think that the French are necessarily known for their softer manners when it comes to their historical colonial possessions.
No, but they have grown softer over time.
Perhaps, though there was a lot of casualties in that anti-terrorism operation the French have run for the last decades or so. But yeah, absolutely. Until recently, you could say France was trying to maintain an open door for dialogue with Russia, and in the same breath, providing lethal weapons to Ukraine. But last month, arguably France ended that more balanced positions and cast its lots even deeper than the other alliance member with Ukraine by keeping the door open to sending troops. Interestingly, in the announcement that President Macron made on that last month, he said something interesting. He mentioned that he had talked to the president of Slovakia and Poland, and they agreed with him. And that, to me, is a clear illustration that just as Germany is going the Eastern European way, right? So that would be...
of course, Poland will take the most extreme point of view, because Poland has had to harbor Ukrainian refugees. Poland has aided Ukraine enormously. Poland scares that if Ukraine falls, then Poland might be next. So if the French position is being influenced by Poland, then it'll be a more muscular one.
Indeed, and economically, just as with Germany, maybe not the same order.
There are benefits.
There are benefits. I mean, if you look at these...
To French companies.
Exactly. If you look at the documentary that Un Président, la France et l'Europe, President, France and Europe, that the French... it's not the government, it is with the acceptance and participation. The French government has released the day after the war started in February 2022, which follows the French president in one of his last-ditch attempts to prevent the war, where he goes to Russia and he goes to Ukraine. And you see in that documentary, as President Macron is meeting with his counterpart, with President Zelensky, the French staff is negotiating contracts for French companies, for trains, for electricity. So what one might see in that, of course, if Ukraine lose to Russia, those contracts will probably go to Russian companies, not French companies. So I mean, there's also an economic incentive there for France to support Ukraine. But certainly the grievance related to France's loss in Africa and to some extent replacement by the Russian interest. Also the defeat. As I think a couple of months ago, a large contingent of French mercenaries, maybe French troops who had replaced their uniform just before entering, so way also on the president's mind. 40 to 60 French mercenaries reported to die in Ukraine just a couple of weeks ago.
And you were in Ukraine and you saw a lot of soldiers, military equipment, including the Iron Cross, apparently, on certain vehicles.
Well, there is certainly many in Europe and around the world who are unsettled by the signs and insignias that are related to the Third Reich.
Third Reich.
The Third Reich, in the Ukrainian military today. Yeah. And I would say France certainly. I mean, when you
It's such a contradiction because the president is Jewish. It's such a contradiction. You have that, a Jewish president, along with such
to which an
symbols.
Ukrainian, to which an Ukrainian friend said, in the concentration camp they had capos.
Oh, well, but let's touch upon UK and move on to Eastern Europe. You've talked about the Weltanschauung of Germany, guilt-ridden, and the economic incentive. France, which tried to negotiate, but at the same time wants to be a big power and has economic advantage to gain as well. What about the UK? You haven't touched upon it.
Yeah, well, in a few words, the UK is doing the US bidding. One can say,
it's the most extreme of the three.
It is, and in fact, historically, that better than I do. The UK also has an axe to grind with Russia. Historically, trying to prevent Russian advance into Persia.
Well, they played the great game in the 19th century.
Exactly. So
the Iron Curtain was something that Churchill coined when he said that it had descended upon Eastern Europe.
That's right.
And UK opened up to Russian money. In fact, I was in London. I was in the city of London. I saw Russian money pour in. One of my partners, the late David Eisenberg, would often comment that we are legitimizing the ill-gotten proceeds of Russian criminal syndicates in London. And that is leading to the purchase of the likes of real estate in Mayfair and Chelsea Football Club. And of course, the Russians assassinated a large number of people on British soil, and that hurt British pride. And now, of course, Britain has confiscated Chelsea Football Club de facto. It has said no to Russian money, and the British have trained a lot of Ukrainian soldiers, and the British are taking a far more anti-Russian point of view. It's reversion to mean almost than, say, Germany.
The point of view of many Russians will be, how did those criminal syndicates were started and enabled in the first place in the 1990s with the help of our capital, with the help of closing our eyes on the corruptions and enabling and creating those oligarchs, right?
It was wealth transfer, some Russians argue, from Russia to the UK.
Yes.
Russian oligarchs send their children to British boarding schools. Russian oligarchs bought country houses and wonderful apartments in London, and the proceeds that they earned from selling oil and gas and nickel and all the other commodities Russia is famous for went to yachts in Monaco and
we were happy to
football clubs in Britain.
Open our arms to that.
Yeah.
But you're right, and if you add to that the history of the Great Game, you have a perfect storm for the UK sort of continuing on its position.
So very briefly, UK, the most anti-Russia of the three. France, the sandwich in middle, the meat, and Germany, the most soft on Russia. In fact, they're dependent on cheap Russian gas for their industry, so they obviously have reason to be soft towards Russia. Now, how do these three now, with their three varying Weltanschauungs, differ from the new members? Very quickly, because we want to move on to the next bit as well.
Well, as we mentioned at the beginning, the new member come up with that fresh history of dominations, of suffering with Russia, with the Soviet Union, and that certainly create and explain their more aggressive stance toward Russia.
So, are they willing to spend more money? Are they willing to increase the size of their military? Are they lobbying in Washington for more active U.S. operations against Russia?
I mean,
practically what all is going on? Because you're unique. Your family hails from Romania. Mm-hmm. You're a French person. You're living in Washington. You travel a lot to the war zone, so you have a unique point of view.
I mean, what I can say from what I've seen in Romania, they are very happy to hide behind the U.S. missiles on the Black Sea, more than spending into a defense budget, right? I mean, it's Romania has those I forgot the name now, but those missiles that can carry a nuclear head on its territory, and that's certainly for Romania. For many Romanians, it's enough. It's good enough, right? And it is a concern that many American president, Democrat or Republican, have expressed, right? And it is a concern it should be a concern for European countries themselves, because if you look at the actual numbers in the military, France has 180 men in uniform today, and 180,000. The UK cannot even fill a football stadium. It's about 70,000. When you match that with over 1 million Russian soldiers who are battle hardened, excuse me. But certainly the reality might come kick you in the face if you don't pay attention to those. And you don't build an army. Expert would say, tell you, you don't build an army overnight. In the context where both in Eastern and Western Europe you have inflation, you have a lot of, you have a budget that is not balanced to start with. So the
European debt, especially in Southern Europe, has reached alarming proportions, and even the French debt GDP ratio is 97%, if I remember correctly.
And this was downgraded a couple of years ago.
Yeah, and the UK isn't doing well either.
Absolutely.
Economically, the UK post Brexit is in acute crisis.
So when you see you might not necessarily see the means that match the rhetoric. When the population will be faced with spending more in defense, when social services and economic growth is not prioritized.
Germany is going through deindustrialization right now. I have a big piece on the German economy, which I encourage everyone to read. I have another piece on Vladimir Putin's long game, which I co-authored with retired CIA officer Glenn Carl, and both of which would make great extra reading. But the sum of the situation is that Russia has great reservations and has a paranoia, and the Western European economies are in deep trouble. So Russia has a greater will to fight, whereas the Western European, and by extension NATO, will to fight is much weaker.
And will influenced by the means, right? If you look at the latest IMF numbers, in the Western club, only Russia and, if you include Russia in the West here, and certainly it is, only Russia and the US have had economic growth the last years, while Europe has been down. So there is certainly a possible moment of recognition, and that might take the shape of countries replacing their leaders in Europe. And you saw that
happened in Slovakia. Fico is back in power.
Absolutely. Yeah. So it is an
alarming situation. So let's wrap up. Too many players are pulling in too many different directions in NATO. Is now NATO, like the United Nations, high-sounding but utterly ineffective?
Right, and that's the counter argument to the cheers when Sweden and Finland announced they would join NATO, that NATO won and NATO is expanding and NATO is actually coming out as the big winner of the conflict in Ukraine.
Just very quickly on Sweden and Finland, we cannot forget Turkey is a part of NATO, and Turkey extracted its pound of flesh to let Finland and Sweden in, and Turkey is playing all sides in this conflict. It is selling Barkatyar drones to Ukraine whilst doing deals for oil with Russia, and probably reselling Russian oil to Europe.
It is a very good point, because many in France have expressed concern that Turkey is more of a security concern than Russia.
Yeah.
If you look at
a lot of Europeans think so.
If you look at 2020,
off the record,
absolutely.
If not on the record,
or even on the record before the war, Macron said NATO is brain dead and was really concerned about Turkey playing what he looked at as a refugee card, right? Threatening to overflow Europe with more Syrian refugees than others, not only Syrians.
Which Recep Tayyip Erdogan did.
Was not afraid, absolutely. So for many in Europe, and in France, certainly. There is a lack of priorities here. Turkey is more of a direct, again, with the refugee issue, right? It's more of a direct.
Also, religion. Let's not forget that it was Valéry Giscard d'Estaing, a French president who wrote who was in charge of the drafting committee for the European Constitution, who said, Christianity is the civilizational bedrock of Europe. Right. And Jacques Delors himself was a very devout Catholic, and Turkey is a Muslim power. Turkey besieged Vienna twice. There are historical memories, and Russia is seen as a part of Christendom, even though it may be Orthodox. But still, it is the same cultural fabric, broadly speaking, whilst Turkey isn't.
So if you look at the conflict today through the lens of the lack of economic, means, that bigger pictures about what Turkey is and the recent, events in history with Turkey and the conflicts in Syria and the refugees. Another take on NATO is that this is actually not looking very good for NATO, because many members will decide that the priority are wrong here.
And in Eastern Europe, you're already seeing people talking about building walls and fences to keep immigrants out.
Yeah.
And so there are fault lines within NATO itself now.
Yeah, and it would be certainly interesting to see how France, who is less involved with Eastern European countries as is Germany in terms of markets, in terms of history, will go about whether fully casting its lot with the Eastern European country, or some, because we mentioned Hungary is a bit of an exception, on an aggressive Central Russia, or coming back to a more balance, keeping the door open for diplomatic resolution of the conflict, which many say it's in national interest.
I see. All right,
and that might go through a change of governments. And we've seen in the UK. UK's have changed governments. Osmond has as many as the Third Republic in France between the two world wars.
Yeah, so many prime ministers, including one with the shelf life of a lettuce.
Hopefully the outcome will not be another world war.
All right, on that hope, thank you, Flavius, for making the time. Pleasure and a privilege to have you on the podcast again.
Thank you, Atul, for an excellent conversation as always.
Thank you. Bye.